Tableau belongs to a category of software that's become pretty popular in the last several years. It's kind of evolved as time has gone on. Business intelligence is what it usually is referred to. Business intelligence software. It's kind of an evolution of a couple of other things which have come up in the computer world. One of the earliest kinds of software that could sort of be an ancestor or a predecessor of a program like this was Excel. When Excel first started to allow us to create charts, graphs, pivot tables, pivot charts, that kind of thing, where we could do more than just treat the program as a fancy ledger book or something like that. One of the old but true cliches, a picture is worth 1,000 words, sort of was the basis for some of this, because when Excel started allowing us to do charting, graphing, and other kinds of pictorial interpretation of data, many people found that they could understand things like trends in the data, increases or decreases in sales, that sort of thing, a little bit more easily. In more general terms, software that is designed to collect data, organize data, analyze data, is also in the business intelligence category, sort of. When you have a program like Microsoft Access, you need to first collect your data, then you need to organize it in order to understand things in it. You then need to do your analyses. That's when you really get understanding. Once you've collected it, organized it, analyzed it, hopefully then you'll understand what's going on in your data. But programs like Access and Excel are not really BI software as we understand it now. The term is a little bit more specific. Business intelligence software lets us understand our data all right, and programs like Tableau allow us to connect to our databases. But there's a little more to it than that. Business intelligence software allows us, at least it should allow us, easy data connection. The program in question should be able to talk to at least 3 or 4 of the major kinds of database out there. Excel files, even text files, relational databases, SQL Server and Oracle, even cloud-based data sources, Google Analytics, Amazon Redshift, and OLAP data sources such as Microsoft Analysis. So if you want to work with data under any of the several most common standards, allowing easy data connection is pretty much an essential. Being able to create visuals as well as tables is very important because, again, picture worth 1,000 words. Many people who would be intimidated by a huge batch of data in an Excel-style sheet could take one look at a chart and after maybe 3 seconds see something is good or great or not good. It's helpful if the software in question can go for what is loosely called user friendliness now, the thinking being that the software should not be particularly hard to work with. You shouldn't need a PhD in computer science to understand it. Being computer savvy would be helpful, of course, having worked with, let's say, Excel or Access to understand some of the groundwork on which the data are based. But BI software now also has another feature that has begun to play in a good deal. You'll hear the term dashboards. Dashboards are a collection of graphs and or charts and or occasionally tables and or occasionally lists, all together arranged in a way that let us really understand both the quick bottom line kind of stuff that shows up in a chart and then be able to glance over at the table of data, understand it as well. And even if we can't change the data from, let's say, a program like Tableau, we can certainly understand what's going on in the data. And if there are any trends that we need to check into, anything we need to be aware of, any potentially alarming things, at least we can see them easily and do something about them quickly. But the idea of the dashboard in modern BI software also has another aspect, which is that many dashboards are interchangeable in terms of their components, almost like Lego blocks or something. And these features together allow for business intelligence and business analysis to proceed at least a little more quickly than they used to. And more importantly, they allow for easier understanding of the data. You can work with bigger blocks of data. You can understand what's going on a wider scale, and hopefully take correct action, useful action, a little quicker than the next guy, a little quicker than the competition. That is where a program like Tableau will come into play, as we will now see. I'm going to go ahead and tuck my slides away for the moment. And I've already got Tableau open here. And I want to start by talking about a couple of the most basic points. Programs like Tableau, first and foremost, need a data source. There are some other programs running around in the computer world, like Crystal Reports, which do not have data in and of themselves, but can easily connect to data sources and then do things with that data. That is essentially the same as with Tableau. If we want to work with data, we have to have a source. So if I take a look over here in the initial window of the program, I can connect to any one of a bunch of different files. I can connect to an Excel file, text files, Access files, even PDFs if they contain the right sort of data. What I'm going to do here for openers is use a text file, or at least something that the program would consider to be a text file. I click that, and I can look for a file. I've already happened to have navigated to it. This file is officially a Microsoft Excel file, as we can see, but it's a comma-separated values file, which means that as far as Excel is concerned, it's only being stored in the Excel spreadsheet. There's no formatting, there's no fancy schmancy to the details of it at all. It's pretty much just raw data, and it happens to be stored in Excel. I'll open this file, and after a second or two, what we should see is the initial layout of the data. And when we want to just take an initial look at the data, that's what the program starts with. If I were to actually minimize Tableau here for a second and actually open up the file in Excel, we would see that Excel, as I said a moment ago, treats it just like an ordinary Excel file. But there's nothing in here except the raw data, about 25 columns and about 9,400 and something rows. You can see that the information is laid out the same in Tableau as it is here. And the only major difference is that the labeling at the top tells us a little bit about what kind of information is in each column. Having gotten a look at the data, and I don't have to do too much scrolling to see that everything's pretty much the same as it was in Excel, I can now go down here to the tab for Sheet 1 and simply click it. And the next thing I know, I'm actually looking at the layout for Tableau itself and the space in which I can use the information which has been hooked up or brought in for me. I can't, as I said a moment ago, change the information from Tableau. I can't, electronically speaking, reach through the TV screen and spot the weatherman if I don't like the report. But I can look at the information, I can use it, and I can also change over here exactly how much of each thing I'm looking at. I can scroll up and down and pull up whichever dimensions or measures, I'll talk about that in a second, that I need to do my data analysis. Let me talk for a minute about the layout of the program itself. There are a couple things here which are pretty mundane, pretty straightforward, things we've seen for many years in the Windows environment. We have our menus up here: File, Data, Worksheet, Dashboard, etc. One small point that you want to be aware of is that, to the best of my knowledge, and as of current writings, Tableau does not have an auto-save feature. So if you happen to work with a copy of the program, don't forget to save regularly. Control-S, file save, whatever suits your preference. But the menus themselves work pretty much the way menus have always worked. Click the menu, you can go to submenus, of course, and check or uncheck items, etc. Then if we look down just below the menus, we see our toolbar. And again, the toolbar works very similarly to toolbars in the Microsoft Office, in the Adobe Creative Suite, etc. We have buttons for things like undo and redo. Thank goodness for undo and redo. We have the ability to hook up to new data sources or to pause auto updates. For various reasons, we might not want updates to be frequent and automatic. We also have the ability to bring up new worksheets, do some other things like duplicating data. We even have the ability to highlight in the style of an ordinary highlighter. We can actually specify, by highlighting with color, things that we want to show as important. Then, if we look over on the left side, much as in some other programs, we have some navigational type tools over here. More specifically, what you're looking at over here in this sidebar are the two main tabs that we use to pull data in and do things with it. The Data tab, we'll hear the term data pane to refer to this space then, shows the dimensions and the measures, the information that we pulled up from our file a moment ago. When we want to do things with that data, we will sometimes use the analytics. We will do things like summarize, we will model, we can customize the layout. So you'll hear about the data pane and the analytics pane. We're mostly going to be focusing on the data pane here for this intro. We also have a number of other spaces sitting over here in the main working area. And these two spaces, the columns and rows, are referred to as shelves. You'll also see over here the pages shelf, the filters shelf, and then we also have the space down here, the marks shelf with the various subsections in it, color, size, text. And as you'll see, one of the simplest and nicest features of the program is that a lot of our additions of data, a lot of the things that we want to do with our data, can simply be dragged and dropped into the various spaces, the shelves, within this main working space. There are also a few terms that we want to be aware of as general usage if you ever start working with Tableau extensively. A sheet is what the program thinks of as a single data visualization, a bar chart, a line graph, a geographical map, one complete subset of data being shown in some fashion. A dashboard would be two or more of those sheets, sometimes as many as 5 or 6, arranged in such a way as to make a cohesive whole, as to communicate a message. Dashboards usually are thought out to whatever degree, so that you have 2, 3, 4 charts, tables, whatever have you, which can all give the user a clear idea of something going on with the data. A series of dashboards, at least 2 or 3 usually, is considered or referred to as a story. It may sound a little strange to use the term story in a business situation, but if you ever watch a well-organized PowerPoint slideshow, it too is telling a story and giving the viewers, hopefully, some good information in a clear and understandable way. So the terms that the folks at Tableau came up with are not meant to be silly or flippant, but to try and describe what the program is supposed to do. Now, we don't really have to start completely from scratch for our demonstration here. We would now, if we wished, be able to drag items from the dimensions and the measures into the various spaces and let the program create graphics and other kinds of things to demonstrate what's going on with our data. However, I'm going to go ahead and close this file and then open one that's already had some basic content built. So I'll go to File to close here. And I don't need to worry about saving changes. Okay. What I want to do now, as I said, is to open a file that's already got some stuff built into it. And I've got a starter file set up here, which I'll just go ahead and click on. And as we can see, we already have a few sheets, Excel style, in fact, tabs sitting down here. As we go through our demo, I'll talk about each of them. But the very first one talks a little bit about 2 terms that you want to be aware of when you work with this program. Those 2 terms are measures and dimensions. Understanding those things can be extremely helpful. The term measures in Tableau's terminology are values that are aggregated. They can be summed, averaged, counted. They can have a minimum or a maximum. Basically, if you think quantities or values, you'll be in the right ballpark. It would be total number of dollars of sales, total number of miles traveled, anything that can be a quantity or a value. To a degree, you can even talk about dates, but mainly it would be things that you can measure out, as I said, miles, dollars, liters of water, or whatever else. Dimensions are values that determine the level of detail at which the measures are aggregated. Now, if we take a look at the diagram here, we have a small but good example of this. When we talk about the sum of our sales, that is a quantity. The sum is an aggregation or an adding up, but the sales could be thought of in dollars or units, and that is a measure. How many dollars or units of sales do we have? How that information is divided up, talk about region. So central region, east, south, west. In what region do we want to talk about the sales? So the total is one thing, the subtotals according to region is another. So the sales number is a measure, the dimension, the region in which the sales were made. And that's a good basic guideline. It's a good thing to bear in mind whenever you work with the program. Over here in our data pane, we can see that our dimensions are things like city, customer name, department, order date. So we have here a non-quantity type of use of the date. Postal code, region, row ID. Postal codes, at least in the US, are numbers, but we don't add them up or average them any more than we would, let's say, Social Security numbers. So the postal code can be thought of as a dimension rather than a measure. But how many miles you might travel from one postal code to another, that would be a measure. And if we drag the divider up a little bit here, we can see that our measures would be things like discount, possibly as a percentage, order quantity, how many we wanted there, product base margin, profit, sales, shipping cost, unit price. The generated items here would come from, let's say, a map of the US. So we would simply put the information here on a map, which we'll do a little later, and see which states, which zip codes, postal codes, had the largest or the smallest number of sales. That's the essential point about measures and dimensions that we want to be aware of. And as we can see up here, the region is set up for the columns. So here are our regions by column. And the rows, or the horizontal dimension, if you will, is the sales number. If I wanted to work with what they call a continuous field, I might drag sum of sales up into the columns area. You can see that the program is now divvying things up according to region in a slightly different way. But dragging the items around, the dimensions and the measures, is one of the things about the program that makes it easier to use, that we can indeed drag things where we want. If I were to drag the sum of sales down to color over here, I can see that now, instead of having the heights of the columns tell me how sales are doing, the color of the piece of the bar here, light blue, dark blue, tells me whether the sales were good or bad. I glance at my legend over here, and I can see exactly that. One other point about the program that's a little more subtle, but also in our favor, is how easily we can drag things back and forth to try out different arrangements of our data and hopefully pick up on trends, important information, good or bad. The fact that we can play around with the layout means that we can learn things a little more easily. We don't have to be stuck in one setup and have all kinds of hoop jumping to go through to undo it or redo it. If I now go to our next sheet, sales by department, I can start a little more fresh. I could drag the sales item from the measures here into our columns space, And we see now that I'm just getting one bar to represent all of the sales, not because anything's wrong or screwed up, but simply because I haven't divided it up or differentiated it yet. If I go to our dimensions and I find department, you'll notice they're in alphabetical order, which is convenient. I drag department to our rows shelf up here. And now I've got something similar to, but not the same as, the layout I had in measures and dimensions. Instead of going by region, I'm going by department. So the thinking here is that I can subdivide a measure, like sales, by any dimension I want. And the main question is not whether, but simply which dimension is going to make the most sense for me to look at my data. Now, the main point is, again, the drag and drop capability, making things easy. But there's another factor which I sort of demonstrated a moment ago, and I want to go into a little bit more depth on now. You will have noticed that I was dragging an item from the rows shelf to the columns shelf. I could have as easily gone the other way around. And if I want to set up a slightly more complex sort of chart, I can do it in any one of several ways. If I had dragged the sum of sales down here to the color shelf, again, I get a color-based depiction of my data. If I had dragged onto size, the size of the squares would tell me something. Of course, here I only have 3 departments worth of data. The squares being so similar in size, it's kind of hard to tell which one's which. So going back up here to columns would make a little more visual sense for this setup of the data. But if I wanted to use both the regions and the departments, I might try another variation again. For example, if I go here and click on the bar chart 2 levels page instead, I could now add another of the measures, or sorry, the dimensions, to this chart. I could go and grab region, which I already used before, and put that in the row space ahead of or behind department. I drag it up here. The little gold marker above the department marker there tells me whether the region is going to go on the one side or the other. If I want region on the left, I just make sure I point there, let it go. Now, the only other thing I have to do is make the space for the chart tall enough that I can see everything. And even then, fairly easy to understand what's going on. First, I'm organizing by region, and then by department. This is what is sometimes referred to as a hierarchical chart, the idea of going with more than one level. If I decided I wanted departments first, I could drag either of these 2 markers to the other side of its companion. And now I've got the information first by department and then by region. So the setup is fairly simple. The drag and drop capability here works very easily. Don't have to struggle with it. And if I want to go still further, I can. What we have going on here, this type of chart dividing first by department, then by region, or vice versa, it works, but some people might say that it looks a little bit cluttered because we have, as you can see here, no less than a dozen of these horizontal bars. We can understand what we're looking at, but what if we wanted to make a comparison with fewer bars? What if we wanted something a little simpler? What if we wanted to be able to compare the departments more directly and not have to worry about all these bars? Well, we can take that kind of capability by going to what's called a stacked bar chart. I'll click on our next sheet down here. And what I want to do is drag region, because we're going to divvy up by region, down to the color shelf here under marks. As you can now see, the regions are indicated by color, and all we have to do is see which set of colored sub bars is longest or shortest or whatever. we can now see a little bit more easily that the technology department looks like it's doing pretty well for all the regions, because the red bar for technology is the longest of all the three. The green bar for the South region, again, looks like it's the longest, at least by a small margin. In the East region, the gold bar here looks a little bit more equal all around. And if we hover on each of these, we can see the sales numbers are coming up rather more closely. And the blue bars for the Central region, same thing. We can hover and see what the exact numbers are. And we find out that office supplies would appear to be the lowest sales number for any of the regions. So when we want to simplify or at least declutter a chart, we can add any dimension, any measure, using almost any of the shelves we wish. And the question is usually not whether we can create a fairly simple and understandable chart, but just how many different variations we care to try and go through before we find what we're looking for. And this goes to show one of the oldest principles in doing the charting of data. There's no one right example. There's no one right technique. Tableau allows us to experiment, as you just saw here, quite easily. Allows us to try out different arrangements. If I dragged region up here to size, we can see that the bar chart does differentiate, but it's not as easy to understand as color. Heck, we can drag on to labeling, but now all the bars are the same color. This kind of obviates the situation we were looking at a few minutes ago. If I drag region onto color once again, come back to our original situation, and visually most people would say, allowing for the fact that we might not be able to print in color all the time, that this is not too visually complicated. It's not quite as cluttered looking as the 12 bars that we had before. The colors allow us to differentiate, but there's only officially three bars in this chart. If we wanted to experiment a little bit, we could go down and click on the bar chart experimentation group here. And again, we could drag region to, let's say, size or label or even detail. Again, no one right technique, no one right setup. If we wanted to swap rows and columns, there's even a button for that up here. For various reasons, some people prefer column charts to bar charts. And although I might need to grab the bottom edge of the chart area and drag down a bit to allow the columns a little more height, be able to see what the numbers look like a little bit better, the concept is the same. We can try different chart types, but the point is that, again, the program will let us experiment. If I grab sales, but this time from measures, and drag it on to the region marker here, what I actually want to do now is replace it. Same principle, different details. Again, I can swap and go horizontal, and the colors of the bars or columns tells me which department did best or worst. If I drag sales to size, again, both the thickness and the height of the columns is telling. Labels, here we go. This is something that some people would understand pretty quickly. Now we don't have to guess exactly how tall each column is. We have the exact number for the sales amount at the top of each column. Pretty straightforward. Now, some kinds of data work well with column charts, bar charts, when we do straight sales figures like this here. But there are other kinds of charts that work better for other kinds of data. And what I want to do now here, I'm going to scroll to the right a bit using our scroll controls, just like you have at the bottom of an Excel window. And I want to click the tab for sales over time. Again, I'll drag the divider down here a bit. This time I'm going to drag sales into the row space. But when I work with this first kind of data, Again, it's not differentiated. We haven't told it what to do about this yet. If I want to do something that's time related, I have to have a dimension in my collection which relates to time. Well, order date would do pretty well for that. So I'll grab a hold of order date and drag it up into the columns shelf here. And the program figures that the most logical depiction of our data now would be a line chart. It's very basic at this point. We can make it a little more elaborate here in a minute, but it does make some sense. We can see that there was a sharp increase in sales from 2013 to 2015 and a slightly more gradual increase through 2016. If I want to subdivide the time-based data a little more, the trick of it would be to go up to my year order date field or marker here, click the drop-down on the right side of it, and select quarter down here about halfway in the menu. Then I can see that although the original information, the original depiction was correct, there's a little more to it than that. We can see now that if we follow through the quarters, we can even hover on the different places where the line turns and twists. We find that as we go through 2013, there's an uptick in sales from the third quarter to the fourth. Shouldn't surprise us, Christmas season and all that. Then we go back down to the first quarter of 2014. It gets pretty level across there, pretty low. And then it leaps upward again in the third quarter of 2014, down again, beginning of 2015. And then here's our really big jump. And it turns out that even at the beginning of 2016, this time is our highest point of all. Then it plummets and then continues to rise again. So there's a bit of a cyclic pattern. There's a bit of a predictability to it. By subdividing in quarters, we make that pretty easy to see. If we had wanted to go to months, we could do so. Same general depiction of the line, but a little bit more finely divided. If I go to weeks, again, same basic pattern, but finer divisions of data. You can decide which of these will work for you. Quarterly seems to be pretty clear without giving us too much stuff to easily digest. Now, what if I wanted to, again, subdivide my data? What if I wanted to set things up where I could see by, for example, region? All right. I will go down and click on Sales Over Time, Overlapping Lines. Again, I have to drag the divider down here so I can see my general squiggle. And what I'm going to do now is grab a hold of region over here from the dimensions, drag it onto the color shelf, and now we're getting the same basic data, but subdivided. We're looking at the same basic set of data, but subdivided by region. And now we can see that, again, by region, it looks like the East region is sort of leading the pack. It's only in late 2013 that the West region got the lead. After that, East seems to have jumped up for the most part and gotten the top spot. And it does indicate, again, that not only is there that cyclic pattern, later part of the year seems to increase in sales, but we also can see that the South region is in all of these main jump ups doing the least amount of business. If I were the head of the company, I would now be trying to find out what was going on in the South, not assuming there was a problem so much as figuring out whether there was anything we could do to improve sales. With only 4 regions, looking at this information is not too tough. The main problem would be if we have more than 4 or 5 distinct values, because at that point, the sort of mental flinch looking at too much data and thinking, oops, clutter, becomes a little bit more obvious. This is about as much information as the average person can easily assimilate, pick up, understand. What if we have more information than that? What if we have, as they say, more than 4 or 5 distinct values? Well, if I take a look at our sales over time multiple rows, we have a somewhat similar situation, except that it's over a smaller space. We have here just the order dates and the departments, the regions, I should say, excuse me. In this situation, the problem would be if we wanted to find out about categories rather than regions. If I were to go to my dimensions, find category up here near the top, drag it onto region. Now I'm doing a replacement as opposed to an addition. Regardless of exactly whether I do this by year or by quarter or by what, that's a lot of data. If I switch over to quarter for a second here, looks like psychopathic spaghetti, or like somebody took a big bundle of colored cables and just tossed them around on the floor. Even if I go back to year, it's still not very understandable. At the very least, there's a lot more data here than I would want to look at. So if I change the way this is laid out, if I drag category from the color onto rows, now what we see is that I've taken the colors out, but more importantly, I've divided up the trend lines or the sales lines so I can now look at one at a time. This is not necessarily an ideal solution, but it's a little less cluttered. You can look at each set of numbers one at a time and hopefully see which lines are the flattest, or which ones go up and down the most, or which ones are sliding downward, and say to yourself, in essence, well, here, rubber bands, the sales are low but steady. If we start in 2013, 322, if we go to the end, 4,108, but the line still looks pretty flat. We're not seeing any huge jumps. Contrary-wise, if we look at office machines, sales numbers there, 37,969 in 2013. As we go up the data points here to the end, almost 500,000 units at the end of 2016. So that's a good jump. That's obviously a tremendous increase. Looking at any of the other lines, tables went from 18,000 odd in 2013, over 150,000 in 2014, jumped up to almost 490,000, but then dropped a little. Again, being able to look at these one at a time is at least less confusing. We may still have to do some scrolling, but certainly we can understand each individual subset of data. And as you can see here, when I hover on each of the lines, one of the data points pops up and allows me to read information pertaining to it. If I had gone by quarters instead of by years, same principle, I would just get more data or more data points. All of this information is useful, but there is one other aspect of this that we should talk about. We've discussed the business of regions here. We've talked about the fact that there are regions, east, south, whichever. If we want to look at the information geographically, if we want to see how it really plays out against the true locations in the states, we need a map. Luckily, the program does have the ability to pull up maps and deposit data, especially if we tell it, for example, which zip codes or postal codes the information was culled from. So if I click on sales by state down here, I can now go ahead and use geographic type data to find out exactly where things are happening. I can go to my list of dimensions here. I find state near the bottom. I give state a double click. And what Tableau will do, since it quote unquote understands about states, countries, and so on, is it puts up a map and says initially that there were sales in at least some of these states. We can see that it left out Alaska and Hawaii. We do see down here at the bottom left that there are 49 marks, which would seem to imply the 48 states and presumably DC. If we don't see information about Alaska or Hawaii or wherever else, that may be because the map doesn't include it, or because, more likely, we don't have any data for those areas. In other words, the program can only work with the data that it's been given. This is not necessarily a bad thing. Now, since we have a map, we can ask the program to show us sales based on the states. So if I go down to my measures, I find sales, and I drag it to, let's say, our color shelf here, we're now looking at the sales by state. The darker the state, the higher the sales. And if we hover on each of the states in turn, we can see the numbers actually pop up. So West Virginia had among the smallest sales, 37,552. Massachusetts was the champ with a little over 1 million, but Texas is not too far behind, just under 1 million. California, a little lower than that. Among the lighter states, Nevada, relatively small population for all the size of the state. Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota. So hovering gives us the information. Of course, you might say this wouldn't work too well in, let's say, a PowerPoint presentation if we needed to do an electronic snapshot of this, but there are ways around that. We'll talk about that in a moment. The key point is that we can use mapping of various kinds to lay out our data, and we can interact with this information. I'm sure you've noticed that during this session, what I've been doing here is hovering, clicking, etc., on various parts of my charts, and it responds. The program is able to work with me to whatever degree based on the layout, whether it's a bar chart, column chart, line chart, etc. Even the small degree of interactivity I've been demonstrating so far is at least moderately informative. If we wanted to be a little more specific, if we wanted to see information a little bit less plain or a little more carefully elaborated maybe, we can switch to a different kind of map, what is sometimes known as a symbol map. Again, I'm going to switch sheets. I'm going to go to the sales by postal code, and I'm going to find postal code in my dimensions, give it a double click. Takes a second or two. Now I see that the map is showing me a large number of blue dots, not distributed strictly by state. We said postal code. So wherever there's a blue dot, that's where at least some sales have occurred. If I wanted to get a little more specific in this kind of map, I could, for example, grab a hold of sales and drag it to size up here, the size shelf in my marks area. And now, although, again, not necessarily the only way to go, I've got a bunch of dots on the map, and now you could say, the bigger the dot, the more the sales. In fact, if I hover on a dot, what I'm seeing is that the postal code 75061, which is not too far out of Dallas-Fort Worth, had pretty considerable sales, 376,000 odd units. Up here in Montana, postal code 59715, rather less. Again, size of the dot tells us something. If we hover on one of the really small dots, postal code 83440 in eastern Idaho, it looks like, the sales were only 2,846 units. Over here in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, oddly enough, here are some of the biggest sales. And if we slide down to very roughly where New York City is, shouldn't surprise us that the sales are at least moderate. In fact, I can zoom in. I can even click on the button here for the plus, and then in this little drop down, I can go to the pan tool, as in panning and zooming, panning and tilting, the four-headed arrow, grab and drag, and look for bigger or smaller dots anywhere in the country, hover on them, and see what the numbers look like. I could zoom in still further. If, for example, I wanted to look in, the Cleveland metro area. So now we see that the individual dots are telling us only a little sales here, little sales there. Go over to the East Coast, bigger dots up here in upstate New York, or right along the Jersey coast. That's what our symbol maps can do. Heck, I could even go ahead and grab a hold of profit and drag it onto colors. And now, if I zoom out a couple clicks here, what we would see is that not only do the size of the dots tell us something, but the color of the dots will tell us whether there's profit in there. All I have to do again is zoom out far enough, and we have a rather orange dot down here. The sales were pretty large, but the profit was actually in the red, in the negative. Contrary-wise, if we go down here again to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, a lot of sales and at least a moderate profit. Over here, a lighter blue dot, profit was fair to middling, even though sales were pretty good, and so on. Oh, here's a really, really tiny one. Sales only 136 and a profit of only 3. So zooming, panning, hovering on these items, fairly easy and fairly straightforward. However, if I want to make the colors a little bit more discrete, if I want there to be more specific divisions between the colors, I can go over here to my legend and actually double click on it. And instead of using this continuous gradient or a swath of color, I can turn on stepped color, set the number to, I don't know, 5 or 6, and I could tell the program if I wish to use a full color range. That way the colors are a little bolder, they stand out better, makes it a little easier to see what we're doing. Click OK. And now we can see the colors a little bit more clearly. Furthermore, I could go to my size shelf here, give it a click, and I can adjust the size of the dots. This is not changing the numbers. This is simply changing how big the dots are to represent those numbers. So now even some of the small dots are showing up better. Here we just have to sort of strike a balance between having the dots big enough to see and having the very largest dots, as you can now see, overwhelming all the small ones. There's no one right setting. We can just play around with it until we get what we think makes reasonable sense when the smallest dots are just big enough to see, for example. And close that up. Now, I'm just doing a very simple demonstration, but you can see how little effort this is all taking. The amount of time I have to spend doing this, and I'm explaining it as I go, of course, but the amount of time that I would have to spend doing this if I were actually putting together a piece of a dashboard would be very short indeed, especially if I knew where I was going with my data. The whole drag and drop, double click, slide things. These are all techniques which we're reasonably used to if we worked with any modern computer for more than a year or two. So the program gives us the ability to lay out data quickly, and as we see here, just hover on any of the dots to ask it what it can tell us. If I go to our next tab down here, the Show Me, I can play around with presets. I actually have in the program the ability to click on the Show Me button at the top right here. Then what the program's going to do is when I tell it what kinds of dimensions or measures I want to work with, it's going to take an educated guess on which layouts would be the most efficacious, the most useful, the most helpful, and it will let me click on those in the Show Me dropdown. It will actually not let me use layouts which it can't figure out how to put together. So if I now choose a couple of things in my data pane, for example, if I click on postal code, if I then hold down, let's say, the control key so I can select items that are not adjacent, postal code, state, profit, let's say, down here in my measures, then let go my control key, the Show Me panel has come alive. I could now click on, for example, the pie chart, where it's going to try and show me pies based on postal codes. That might not be very good. I could click on horizontal bars, which makes a little more sense even if I still have to scroll. Filled maps takes a second to do its thing. This is very similar to what we were looking at a few minutes ago, except that now the areas of the postal codes themselves are outlined on the map. I could go to the symbol map, which is the dots, and play around with that. The key thing is that whenever I hover on one of the show me's and look down toward the bottom, it'll say, in this case, for area charts, discrete, we need one set of dates, at least one dimension, presumably, one or more measures. This particular item is grayed out because I don't have the data for it here. If I go to the box and whisker plot, technically that works. Whether it's efficient, whether it makes visual sense is another matter. But if the chart in question is not grayed out, I can try it. Of course, the packed bubbles, not so much. But side-by-side bars, stacked bars, horizontal bars, it looks like maps would be our best bet here because we're talking about postal codes as being one of the integral items. Therefore, we want to see what's going on in each postal code. When we're finished, we can just click the Show Me to tuck it away, and we've already got our map. And again, we can zoom in. Again, we can click the little drop down here and go to the pan control. We can drag back and forth. We can zoom in on any area we want, as you can see here. And again, hover on whichever postal code, find out what's going on in that area, whether the profit at least is positive or negative. All of this, though, leads up to the idea of the dashboard, because once we've created the components for the dashboard, we want to put them together. So now I'm going to go down here to our final tab, the Superstore Sales, and I'm going to tell the program which items I want on my dashboard. And there are at least 3 which I'm going to use here. The 3 that we are going to use for this example are going to be sitting over here in our sheets. We create the single item on each sheet and then choose which sheets go into the dashboard. So it's almost like the way some Excel setups work. I want sales by department, so I double-click that. I want sales over time, so I double-click on that. And finally, I want sales by postal code. And as we can see, although I might have to scroll a bit in this situation, I've got all 3 visible. In fact, if I click on each of the titles, I can go to the top and I can grab and move it around, or I can go to its top edge, have to be a little careful here, and I can resize the thing. I can actually click the top and make it taller or shorter. And there's one last thing about working with the dashboard, which, although you do have to turn it on, it's a pretty slick idea. Each component of the dashboard can be made to act as a filter for its buddies, which means that the dashboard becomes at least moderately interactive. It means that the dashboard is truly a dashboard in the sense that you might see in a car. All the dials and gauges and so on the dashboard are all part of the same system. To allow each one to become a filter for its buddies, we go up to the top right where we have a little tiny hollow funnel symbol. If we click on it where it says Use as Filter, we've turned it on. Go to the next one, click the title area, do the same. Third time down here, same thing. Now, if I click on one of my department horizontal bars here, like technology, I'm looking at the data in the other 2 areas of the dashboard just for the technology department. If I go down here to my postal codes and click on one of the circles here, I've now filtered down to that postal code. I'm looking at the technology data for that postal code. And in my sales over time, I could click on one of the quarterly markers here. And now I'm looking at the data for just that quarter. Technology department, that postal code, that quarter. If I want to unfilter, I click the same item again. Turns the filter off. Very simple. Click to turn on, click to turn off, just like a light switch or a ballpoint pen. And eventually, of course, I work my way back up to all my data. So we just have to remember, if we're going to use this multi-filter capability, that we want to turn it on. If I tell the program, don't use this filter, that is, if I unselect the little funnel here, now if I click on one of the bars, furniture, let's say, nothing happens to the other two components of the dashboard. Turn it on, though, and immediately it does its thing. I can click any other bar. In fact, I could control-click a second one, and now I'm looking at data for both my furniture and my technology departments. Control-click whichever, control-click another one. Again, as fast as I can click, turn things on, turn things off, I am looking at the data filtered for those items. As we can see, working in Tableau, although it's certainly a little more sophisticated than Excel, still partakes of some of the basic principles that we can go all the way back to a simple chart in Excel. Drag and drop, picture worth 1,000 words, the ability to build the pieces and then assemble them. It gives us a reasonably intuitive way to pull together business intelligence. There are other features of the program, of course, but the thinking is that when we want to find out what's going on in a business, being able to put the data together reasonably quickly is never going to be a bad thing, especially considering how fast business proceeds today. In closing, I'd just like to say thank you for coming in, and I'll hope that we'll get to see you sometime soon in our classes. We'll look forward to hearing from you. If you want to join any of our classes, www.skillforge.com. Give us a yell, and we'll bring you on board. So thanks for coming in. Have a good afternoon, and take care.